Hey, in today's video, let's talk about the most hated framework for software development. So before I start, give me a guess. What do you think is the most hated framework in the whole software development process? Go and comment below. Okay, now that you hopefully have given your comment, let's talk about the one that, from my point of view, is the framework that pretty much everybody seems to dislike when it comes to software development. And probably it's not going to come as a surprise that the framework that I'm referring to is Waterfall. So Waterfall is a linear approach to project management where usually there is a sequence of actions that follow each other. So typically you are going to start with a gathering of requirements and planning, with next follow up by a design, then followed by coding, then followed by different types of testing like user acceptance testing. And of course, then there's going to be some iterations with fixing bugs and trying to solve those problems that have been identified. And finally, this is going to be released. Obviously, this is a very simplified process and it's much more complex in many situations. But usually what you have in a waterfall process is that until one step of the process is not done and hand over to the next one. So let's say first you gather the requirements and do the planning of the different features that you're going to do. Then you pass it to do the design of said features. Then once the design is ready, you pass it to coding. Then once the coding is ready, testing, so on and so forth. And of course, once you have released it, it comes to the fact that you had to do maintenance. This is something that has happened with companies that do this kind of approach, of waterfall approach, where they actually build this process, define a process, and usually this development process can take between 6 months up to a year. That was a very common process when in companies that have work that are using waterfall. And what happens is that you spend several weeks during planning and design. Then there are several months that you spend with the actual implementation. Then it comes the testing. Then it comes a period for fixing and so on. Meaning that this whole process actually is a very long process that has to be implemented, that has to be done. Which means that the problem is not just that it's long, which in itself is a problem, but said that you start this process. You start your planning, you have closed already the planning, you pass it to development, or to design is done, pass it to development. Your development period might be 3 months, 6 months, or even more. Let's say that in the middle, after 2 months, somebody comes, a customer, and requests for something. But because your planning phase is already closed, you are too late to make changes, which means that if you still have a window for the next planning phase, you might be able to put in the next version, which means that feedback from customers, it was really difficult to add into this process, meaning that this is something that will come really late to be fixed, or the feedback from the user, if it's a fix or a new feature, it's not going to come in the same version, it's going to come maybe another version afterwards. And typically, because the periods are so long, what happens is that maybe one team does that first version, and then the same team does maintenance versions of that previous, of that main release, while another team is actually building the next version. And in many cases, those maintenance versions were not allowed to have new features. They were just maintenance versions, just adding fixes and bugs, fixing bugs, obviously, into the product. And of course, adding bugs to the product, because when you fix bugs, you add bugs. It always happens. There's going to be a ratio. I don't know what it is. It's going to depend on the teams, but there's going to be bugs that you're going to be adding in that process. But let's not go into what bugs are and why you always have bugs in products, because that will be the topic for another video. But they are reality, you have to live with that. So let's talk quickly about the advantages of Waterfall, because Waterfall has its advantages, and actually Waterfall was never developed, or the purpose of Waterfall was not to be used in software development. It was to be used in manufacturing. And when you think about manufacturing, and when you actually are putting together a tool, a product like a car, for example, the process that a car follows through the factory is a very waterfall process as such. Improving the process, that doesn't have to be waterfall. That's a very different story. But the process of building the product, or in this case the car, is a very waterfall process. I don't know anything about that process, but I'm pretty sure that first there's going to be some stamping, cutting of pieces of the metal, shaping them, producing the tires, Then at some point you start to assemble the main body of the car. Then you start adding things like windows, doors, tires, and there's a sequence to this process. And that's why it's a waterfall process. And in these cases, it makes pretty much a lot of sense. You can still improve that process. You don't have to keep the same process for years. Here, for example, Tesla has done a great job where they're innovating all the time on how to improve the processes, or how to improve this by nature waterfall process that car manufacturer typically is. And why is it that it's a process that has been typically very liked by people? Because as a waterfall process, there are like windows where you know that tasks are going to be done, which makes it very predictable, and it's actually something that we are by nature kind of organize ourselves in a kind of a waterfall way. That's usually how we work and how we operate. The problem is, and let's talk now about the drawbacks, is that software development by nature is a very complex process and is not maybe as straightforward as producing a car. And I would say that designing and planning a car is simple. That's a very different story. But once the process is defined, probably the assembly, apart from being very expensive, maybe it's not that complex, because you know that your product is repetitive and your product is going to be basically done the same way pretty much all the time. There's going to be minor variations like different colors of the body, different types of tires, maybe different options, but there's not going to be much. Software products by nature, typically they're always different. Every time that you're building a new product, it's a new product. It has little to nothing to do with the previous products that you have built in the past, which means that the process is a very complex one and it involves a lot of discovery. And here is where Waterfall is failing. Waterfall is not meant for projects that involve discovery. Waterfall is mainly intended for repetitive projects or products. So the problem of Waterfall is that it's not easy to adapt. Although, as I say, some companies like Tesla have been very successful at being able to adapt. But as you can imagine, it's not something that they are adapting every day and that they are changing the production line every day. They change it really often when you think about how production lines for cars have worked in the past, where they are producing pretty much the same model for like 3 years straight without pretty much no variations. The problem of using then Waterfall for software development is that there is a very high risk of not being able to understand the scope of the work. And I don't mean that you don't know what you want to build. You might know what you want to build, but you don't know how long it's going to take you to build it. And that's a very big problem of waterfall projects, which means that very easily there's going to be a scope creep, and that very easily you are not going to be able to do what you thought that you were going to do, because it's going to take much more time to implement than not. What I've seen in the past is that many times there was a plan that you did in the beginning of the new version, and the reality of that plan is that you got something like this. So probably half of the plan, you knew that it was not going to be able to make it to that version, or if it made it, it was not what you were expecting it to be, which is not the end of the world. We all love MVPs, at least I do. At least working MVPs, those I like. So the problem is that when you think about and you compare it to things like Agile, which is much more flexible, that it's much more reactive to customer feedback, and it's a much more iterative way of developing the product, Agile is a much better suited need for software products or for software development than Waterfall is. So, but why do companies still use Waterfall to do software development? Well, there are many reasons, and I would say that the main reason is a cultural one. Many people have worked in other companies and other organizations, industries that are not software development, and they're very used to work in a very waterfallish way. And when they come to software development, they expect that waterfall is going to work. Okay, to a degree it works, it's just not very efficient. And they expect that you are going to continue working in that waterfall way, and that you should know what you had to do, and that you should know how long it's going to take you. But the reality is that you don't really know that. Then, of course, you have regulatory systems. If you are working especially with companies that are depending on different types of certification, or public companies that are going to expect some kind of waterfall process, that's a given. It's going to happen. And in some of the software companies, you actually are going to have to work in a relatively waterfall way with these companies. Although I have worked in some projects with government where actually the government was talking about Agile and using Scrum, which was like, wow. Did they understand it? Well, probably not completely, but they understood that there's probably a better way of doing things than in a very fixed waterfall way, which we know and we have tried with software projects in the past, and it really hasn't worked. So they have been trying to look for new ways of working and new processes that is going to help them. So what are my thoughts? Do I think that Waterfall is useless? It's not a framework to be ever used, and it needs all the despise that is receiving, all the hate that is receiving? Well, I don't think so. Actually, I think that Waterfall makes sense for certain type of products, but those are not software products. And yes, the reality is that most of the companies, no matter what they tell you, no matter how agile they are, they're probably still, to a certain degree, waterfallish in the way that they behave. So, for example, think about the way that companies do budgeting. Most of the software companies are going to be doing budgeting in a relatively waterfall way, and they're not going to do it in a very agile way. Most of them. There are going to be some of them that they do it. Some processes like marketing, sales, they might still happen completely outside the cycle of agile development of a product. That's still, by nature, a very waterfallish way of working. Is it wrong? Not completely. And it makes sense in some cases. So it depends a lot if your process of selling is something that is done by a sales team or something that is done through online subscription. So depends on what you are building, depends on how you are building it, you are going to have some components of being waterfall or not. And as I said, waterfall still has a place when you think about production of goods. Usually, most of the processes are going to be very waterfallish in nature, and that's completely okay. They can still be improved, and you can still be agile on the way that you are handling those processes. So if you are working with physical products and you're a product manager in those products, don't despair. You're not trapped necessarily in waterfall. You can still improve the ways of working. And should you use waterfall for software products? Well, my opinion is that no, you should not. You should try to use something like Agile or some of the flavors of Agile. There's quite many. There are some of them that are more optimal than others, but it will depend a lot on the expertise of your team. So choose those methods depend on how expert or the level of expertise and the level of cultural knowledge, let's say, about Agile that there is in your company and with your teams. You can always help them to move forward. You can always help them to be more agile in the future. Don't try to make a company super agile when a company has been waterfall. If you try to do a very big leap, it's not going to happen. It's going to fail. It's going to come with a lot of pushback. Try to do changes little by little. Go improving continuously, and that's going to give you much better results. So how about you? Are you using Waterfall? Are you using Agile? What flavor of Agile are you using? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. It helps YouTube to promote it to other people that might have similar interests. I will see you in the next one. And remember, stay safe.